Olá, sejam todas e todos muito bem-vindos. Eu sou o Yuri Pita, ao meu lado, Fernanda Manhota, analista de internacional da CNN. Nós temos o prazer de receber nesta edição do CNN Entrevistas o cientista político Steven Levitsky, autor de 11 livros, um deles um grande best-seller no Brasil, Como as Democracias Morrem, também recém-lançado aqui no Brasil, Como Salvar a Democracia. Steven Levitsky está no Brasil para uma série de eventos acadêmicos, compromissos na Universidade de São Paulo, na Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso, e fez a gentileza de nos atender aqui na CNN. Mr. Levitsky, such a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for that. I'd like to start this conversation, this interview, asking you an overview of this year USA, America's election. For any point of view, it's such a unique elections. We have an attempt against a candidate, Donald Trump. We have a President, Joe Biden, giving up on trying a new time on office. And now we have Kamala Harris, the Vice President, a woman, a Black and Asian woman, trying to get to the White House. And how do you see this year elections from your point of view and from the perspective that U.S. America has such U.S. democracy has such problems, as you have pointed out since 2018, How Democracies Die, when it was published?
Well, in many respects, it's a continuation of the politics of the last decade. The U.S. politics are very, very deeply polarized, and extreme polarization of this type leads to crisis. It makes it more likely that there will be maybe violence, maybe crisis around an election, very unfortunately an assassination attempt. These are the kinds of things that happen in the middle of a very, very intense polarization. The 2016 election was fairly crisis-ridden. The 2020 election obviously was very crisis-ridden, and this election is equally high stakes. The removal of President Biden from the ticket was really very unprecedented, but it's mostly a product of the fact that, first of all, he was frankly a terrible candidate. He was going to lose the election, and normally losing an election is not the end of the world. It sometimes the party chooses a bad candidate and the party loses, and that's too bad for the party, but it's not a huge consequence. But in this case, because the rival was Donald Trump, and the likely winner of the election was Donald Trump, a man who actively tried to overturn the results of an election, who arguably encouraged violence in an effort to block a peaceful transfer of power, the first time this had ever happened in U.S. history. And Trump, unlike Brazil, was not held accountable, was allowed to run again. And because he was winning, the Democratic Party basically fell into an emergency situation and came to the conclusion that they had to make a change. And I think that they did the right thing.
And I would like to ask about the Supreme Court. For many years in the U.S., they've been discussing about a reform of the Supreme Court, and at this point nowadays, Biden is again talking about that because we have nine judges, 6 of them conservatives, 3 of them indicated by Trump, and if he's reelected, 2 of them more maybe will be conservative in the next years. So reforming such a traditional institution in the U.S., how do you see in terms of weaken or strengthen the American democracy?
Oh, I think it can strengthen American democracy. Americans have an obsession with original institutions. We have a perception that the institutions that our founders designed in the 18th century, which is an era before democracy existed anywhere in the world, were somehow the best practice for all times and all circumstances. And that is, we treat it as if it were the Bible. But we know, anybody who studies institutions anywhere in the world knows that institutions that work well in one context may not work well in another context. And as societies change, as circumstances change, institutions have to be adapted. That doesn't mean you throw out the Constitution, but to not contemplate the idea of institutional reform is ridiculous. Two quick examples. One, the electoral college that the United States is the only presidential democracy in the world where we don't directly elect the president, where the loser of the popular vote can win the presidency. Other countries used to have electoral colleges, but over the course of the 20th century, all other presidential democracies, including Brazil, the last one was Argentina in 1994, all other presidential democracies got rid of the electoral college because it was considered a useless and maybe problematic institution. We have not. We continue to have an electoral college, and twice in the last generation, the loser of the popular vote became president. That's a problem. With the Supreme Court, we are now the only established democracy in which justices can stay on the court until they die, their entire lifetime. All other established democracies have a retirement age or term limits,
yes,
which is reasonable. We shouldn't have justices staying on until they're 95 years old, ruling against majorities 2 or 3 generations down the line. So the proposal that Biden's making is very basic. A basic ethics code for the Supreme Court, which seems reasonable, and term limits, probably 18 years on the court rather than being on the court for life. All that would do would be to bring the United States in line with other democracies in the world.
In your last book with Daniel Ziblatt, here in Brazil, the title is How to Save Democracy, but the original title is The Tyranny of Minorities. And you argue 2 points. One of this is the one that Fernanda Manhota mentioned, institutional reform, such as Supreme Court, Electoral College, things like that. And you also talk about multiracial democracy. Thinking about the 2 candidacies in the U.S. this year, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, 2 white men, Protestant, and all the typical profile of American white men, and the other candidacy, Kamala Harris, a black woman, Asian woman, and Tim Walz, a white man, Protestant, and things like that. Do you think that these 2 candidacies, they kind of realize, make your point of view, your argument in the book about the multiracial democracy, the key point of this election would, whatever happens to the results, is the way that USA can go through, can go forward a multiracial democracy or not, or giving up on this way?
Yeah, I think this election is very illustrative of the 2 coalitions. The United States has changed dramatically over my lifetime. I'm 55 years old, and during my lifetime, the United States has gone from a place where more than 80% of Americans called themselves white and Christian, to a place where less than 50%, 43% in 2016, consider themselves white and Christian. We have rapidly become a multiracial democracy. In fact, we're the first democratic society in history that is making a transition from in which a once dominant ethnic majority loses its dominant status. Right? White Christians were an overwhelming majority in this country, and they dominated politics, they dominated the economy, they dominated television, they dominated academia, all aspects of life. In 2 generations, over my lifetime, that is changing. It's changing rapidly. And yes, the Democratic Party ticket with Kamala Harris is very illustrative of that new United States in the 21st century. But that change is the loss of dominant status of white Christians can be very threatening, and many Trump voters, many supporters of the Trumpist movement, feel like the country that they grew up in, a white Christian country, is being taken away from them, and that's very threatening and very radicalizing. And that is one of the main impetuses behind the Republican Party. Now, I think that the change in the United States is inevitable. There is a lot of pushback, a lot of reaction. It's been very destabilizing. It could continue to be destabilizing. but eventually we're going to be a multiracial democracy. And I think it's possible that this is the last time that you see a ticket like the Republicans with two sort of openly white Christian men on the ticket. That's not enough to win majorities in the United States anymore.
Fernanda?
Can we change the subject to Venezuela?
Sure.
Okay, so
Depressing to more depressing.
Yeah, from America to Venezuela, then to Brazil.
Just to keep the good vibes. Okay, so about Venezuela, Professor, I would like to ask you about how can we restore institutions that have been politically dominated by a major figure like Maduro, and that are now serving as a tool of a power project. Venezuela is under a crisis, we all know that, but is it possible to restore that? What should they do in this case?
Well, it's a tough question. First of all, I wouldn't think of it anymore as restoring. People talk about a crisis of Venezuelan democracy. Venezuelan democracy is dead. And it's been dead for almost 20 years. This is an authoritarian regime. It used to be a soft authoritarian regime in the first decade of the 21st century, and now it is an outright dictatorship. This is a regime that's been in power for about as long as the Brazilian military regime from 1964 to 1985. We should think of it that way, that the old democracy of the 20th century is dead, and Venezuelans need to build a new one. Now, bringing down an established, a consolidated dictatorship like the Venezuelan one is difficult. And there's a lot of research that shows that it's easier to topple an authoritarian regime in the early years than after it's become established. So there's no easy recipe. There's no single recipe. If there were, the Venezuelans would have found it. The Venezuelan opposition, which has made a lot of mistakes in the past, did everything right in this election. They participated in the election, they unified, they were incredibly well organized under horrific circumstances, terrible repression, total state control of the media, in which most of the campaign team was underground or in hiding or arrested. Despite dictatorial conditions, the opposition won almost 70% of the vote. This was an extraordinary achievement by the opposition in the most unfair circumstances that one could imagine. And they forced the Maduro government to engage in the most egregious electoral fraud in the modern Latin American history. I'm not exaggerating. I cannot think, at least since the 1930s, of an electoral fraud that was this egregious anywhere in the hemisphere. And so one consequence of that we don't know what will happen to the regime. Maduro may survive. Dictatorships often have ways of muddling through and surviving. But it's been weakened because every single Venezuelan now, every Venezuelan citizen knows that 2/3 of Venezuelans voted for the opposition and the government nakedly stole the election. So every member of the police, every soldier, every government official who walks into the street every day and looks into the face of Venezuelan citizens knows that they know that the election was stolen. So there's a real crisis of legitimacy. Again, that's not necessarily enough to kill the regime, but it has weakened it.
It's kind of a rotten regime, something like this.
Absolutely. And it's been rotten for a while, but it's now rotten.
Openly rotten.
for the world to see.
Yeah.
I hope the Brazilian Foreign Ministry sees clearly enough, but it's also rotten for every Venezuelan to see.
You mentioned foreign policy, Brazilian foreign policy, and we could say all the at least South American and Latin American countries worried about this situation. What role do you think these countries may achieve or may have to help Venezuelan people to restore its democracy, the country's democracy? What role nowadays can other countries play to assure democracy in places like nowadays Venezuela?
So external pressure is always important, but it's always secondary. I think sometimes we exaggerate the impact that external pressure in either direction can have. Ultimately, this is going to be a struggle among Venezuelans. That said, the international community, I think that Latin American governments are ultimately going to be much more influential than the United States in this. The problem in terms of exerting pressure in Latin America is Latin America is always divided, and certainly has always been divided about Venezuela. You have some governments, Argentina is particularly loud, but also Chile, Peru, other governments that have been very, very strong in denouncing the fraud. You have a few governments who are pretending it was a free election. And then you've got the most important government in the region, Brazil, with a very, very cautious, quiet, pragmatic approach. And I understand it's very different from the Biden administration. I understand the logic behind it, that the Brazilian government wants to have a seat at the table, not be dismissed, wants to be able to maintain impact and not sort of, when you tweet things that Milei has tweeted, you don't get a seat at the table. So I understand the desire to maintain a seat at the table. But at some point, the Brazilian government has to realize that if it's not going to achieve anything remotely like democracy, if it's not going to achieve a transition, if the Maduro government is not going to give up anything, much less power, at some point, the Brazilians need to act. Otherwise, they're going to have a seat at the table in the middle of a concentration camp, and nobody wants that.
Still talking about the role of Brazil in this specific crisis, besides what everybody already knows about international pressure, such as economic sanctions and calls for transparency, recently a very important figure in the Brazilian government said that maybe a solution would be suggest a second round of the elections in Venezuela. And this suggestion has been very criticized in the last weeks. So my question for you, Professor, is about legitimacy and also about how dangerous and how a dangerous precedent it could be if one country starts suggesting different electoral criteria that is not established in the original constitution of a country to solve crisis. So I know that everybody is trying to have a good way of dealing with the problem, but the non-intervention principle is something very important for international relations. At the same time that we are trying to reinforce the role of democracy. So how to balance that?
Well, I think non-intervention is often used as an excuse to let, and it has been in the case of Maduro, has been used as an excuse to not to allow authoritarians to remain in power. I mean, if you're talking about sovereignty, popular sovereignty, it is very clear that 2/3 of Venezuelans voted for the Maduro government to leave. And so it doesn't seem to me to be very much in favor of sovereignty to permit that government, or to help that government stay in power, violating the sovereignty of 2/3 of the country. You're right. It would be strange and not ideal for external governments to push for, say, a new election, which is outside the Venezuelan constitution. I think we need to be, when you're negotiating a transition as difficult as Venezuela, and this is a really, really hard transition, a clique that's been in power for a generation, that is very corrupt, that is very violent, getting it out of power is really hard. And so I think all the options do need to be on the table. I think Brazil is right in thinking, or Brazilians in general are right in thinking flexibly and thinking about a range of alternatives. There is some precedent in when President Balaguer of the Dominican Republic stole an election in 1994. The negotiated solution in the end was that he would leave in 2 years rather than 4 years, and they'd hold another election. So they had sort of moved up the next election, and he left after 2 years. It was not ideal, but it was better than just ignoring the fraud and letting him stay forever. So that was the solution. So there's some precedent for it. I think in this case, I mean, what's unusual about the Venezuelan election is this is maybe the first time in the history of the world, honestly, I'm not exaggerating, where the opposition was able to prove that there was fraud, right? They acquired enough of the actas from the polling places to demonstrate to the world, to everybody, that the election was stolen, that Gonzalez actually won the election. So it's not just there's evidence of fraud. It's not just that there's strong suspicions of fraud. It's proven in this case. I can't think of another case where the fraud has been proven. So, that does make it hard to say, well, we don't know, let's have another election, which is sort of the way the Brazilian foreign ministry treats it. We do know, and the Brazilian government knows.
Let's have just a little pause, because we have lots of things to talk about Brazilian democracy. A gente faz rápido intervalo aqui e volta já nesta entrevista com Steven Levitsky, autor de Como as Democracias Morrem e Como Salvar a Democracia. Até já. Estamos de volta com este CNN Entrevistas. Eu e Fernanda Manhota recebemos Steven Levitsky, cientista político da Universidade de Harvard, tem estudado muito sobre sistemas democráticos em todo o mundo, também tem olhar bastante atencioso de pesquisa para a região da América Latina. Professor, I'd like to talk a little bit about Brazil's state of democracy nowadays. You studied a lot about 2022 elections. Lula against Bolsonaro. You, as many scholars said, you saw Bolsonaro as a Trump of the tropics, and Lula's victory a sign of a resilience of Brazilian democratic institutions. Not only his electoral voting victory in the ballot, but also the role Brazilian institutions have played at that time. And after just a little more than 18 months of Lula in office, can we Brazilians take democracy for granted, or the risks of to democracy institutions are still on air?
We can never take democracy for granted. This is something that I think generations of Americans took democracy for granted, and there was a great cost to that. We've been very, very slow. We're still very slow to react to the threat that we're facing. Brazilians, I think, are because of the more recent history with authoritarianism, it seems to me Brazilians are less likely to take democracy for granted, and that's really a good thing. Democracies are always vulnerable because of their very open nature. Democracies have to tolerate political parties, candidates, movements that might not be fully committed to democracy. And so every election there's a potential opening for anti-democratic forces. So citizens, politicians who believe in democracy always have to be on guard. Now, I'm not the one who called Bolsonaro Trump of the tropics. I'm not. That was, I think, the U.S. media.
Yeah.
But I do think that, Brazilian democracy has a lot of vulnerabilities, a lot of problems, a lot of deficits. It's not Switzerland yet. But I do think Brazilians responded pretty well to the threat posed by Bolsonaro. I was very critical of the Brazilian right in 2018 for supporting a guy who was clearly not committed to democratic rules of the game and allowing him to rise to the presidency. But since 2018, there are a number of things that societies and that politicians and that states can do to minimize the risk. You can never eliminate it, but minimize the risk of an authoritarian figure coming to power. And the Brazilian politicians did several of those things after 2018. The 2021 democracy law was an important law. Congress stood up to Bolsonaro's effort to eliminate or to sidestep electronic voting. The statements made by a number of societal figures, including business groups like Fiesp in 2021 making statements in defense of the rule of law and democracy publicly, saying this is a line that we're not willing to cross, is very important. It's a very important signal. U.S. business leaders are not doing that. And then on election night in 2022, the fact that every major right-wing politician in Brazil on election night stood up and said, okay, Lula won, too bad, you know, we look forward to working with Lula, that's it, which is so different from the United States, where more than 80% of national Republican politicians question the results of the election.
Professor, talking about Brazil, we are such an equal country with so much accumulated resentment, and populism is a topic, is something that we need to deal all the time. How can we reinforce, protect our institutions from the populism? Because I think in the Brazilian situation in particular, we're still talking about personalistic people who are the reference of the elections, and in this sense our political system is less strong than the American ones. We're not talking about parties in Brazil, we're talking about people. So populism is something very relevant. So if in the next day we don't have Bolsonaro or we don't have Lula, who will be the next and how we deal with that? So how to protect institutions from populism?
Wow, if I had the answer to that question, I would have a much higher salary.
And the book with this title. Yeah.
I may try to write it, but unfortunately, this is a problem that's not going away. You're absolutely right that public discontent with the status quo over a number of things, over insecurity, over corruption, over poor quality of public services, over entrenched inequality. This is widespread, not just in Brazil, but across much of the world, certainly across Latin America. And that is giving rise to discontent, and discontent when voters are disappointed by one government after another government after another government, they eventually get frustrated and they turn to figures like Bukele or like Chavez or Correa or Milei, who say they're going to burn the whole thing down. And that's becoming more common. It's easier and easier for outsiders because of social media to sort of emerge outside the parties, reach voters by WhatsApp and YouTube, and get elected, denouncing the whole system. Okay. I don't think there's an easy cure for that. I don't think we know how to deal with it. It is something, I mean, to a degree this happened, Trump came within a party, but he's a very similar phenomenon. So all of our democracies outside of Uruguay are dealing with this problem of a lot of discontent and the constant rise of personalistic candidates who come to power denouncing the system. Now, some of those guys kill democracy, Bukele, Fujimori, Chavez. Some of them try and fail, like Trump and Bolsonaro. Others end up being pretty much, Castillo in Peru is another try and fail. Others end up being pretty constrained. I don't think Milei is going to kill Argentine democracy. He's not my favorite guy, but I don't think he's going to kill democracy. And so it may be that democracies, societies, institutions have to get used to a more fluid politics, a more personalistic politics. Brazilian politics has always been pretty personalistic. And a politics where populism is kind of a constant. We have to learn to sort of strengthen democratic institutions so it can live with a degree of populism, because I don't think we're going to just eliminate it.
And it makes me think when you talk about, for example, Javier Milei from Argentina. He's a very popular political leader, not only in Argentina, but also here in Brazil, for example. How do countries and societies should deal with this international populism or something like this. But not only, it's not a matter of right and left, because Lula, for example, is also popular in Argentina. People people know Lula a lot from many times. But how this affect the quality and the function of democracy in countries when other leaderships from other countries can have such a role of influence?
Yeah, I think this is not entirely new. I mean, what's really funny is the most influential model right now in Latin America comes from little El Salvador, right? Bukele is the model that everybody wants to follow, not necessarily Trump or Bolsonaro or Lula or Milei. It's the president of El Salvador. I think this is not entirely new. You know, going back to Che Guevara and Fidel Castro or Perón. Perón was a huge model. Everybody wanted to be Perón in the 1950s in Latin America. The entire left across Latin America was enamored with Castro and the Castro model. And earlier in the century, the left in the region, much of the left in the region, all aspired to copy the Chavez model. And so it's true that it's more pronounced now with social media. And there's a sort of transnationalization, and activists in the Republican Party know all about Milei, and in a way that most of them 10 years ago didn't know where Argentina was on a map. So it's true that because of social media and the internet, we have more information about politicians who maybe come from our ideological side who seem to be having success. But there's a long history of people wanting to copy a model from another country, and they always fail. It's impossible. The context in every country is different. Argentina is not Brazil, is not El Salvador, is not Chile, is not Peru, and nobody, just like another example, sorry to go back, Alberto Fujimori in the early 1990s was a model for the right across Latin America. Yeah. He closed down Congress, he ended hyperinflation, he defeated the Shining Path, he had 80% support. Everybody wanted to be like Fujimori. Jair Bolsonaro in the early 1990s went around saying we should be like Fujimori.
Yes.
Nobody could be like Fujimori. One guy tried, Jorge Serrano, forgotten in history, the president of Guatemala tried to close down Congress, ended up being forced to live many years in Panama. So it's very, very hard. You can tweet about being like some other figure, but to actually implement another country's model is really impossible.
Professor, I would like to ask you about the role of religious groups, which are raising a lot in Brazil, and they are really relevant now in many of our institutions. They are setting agendas in Brazil. I would like to hear your thoughts on that. How do you see this kind of group making difference in democracies such as the Brazilian one?
Well, again, I don't think it's entirely new. It is true, certainly, that a politically active, pretty illiberal, evangelical Christianity is on the rise in Latin America. I mean, Pentecostalism has been expanding for more than half a century, but only in the last couple of decades has it begun to really mobilize and enter the political arena. And this is also happening in the United States. It has been for a long time, but it's a legitimate process. There are always going to be different movements, different schools of thought, different groups in society that organize and push an agenda. Some of those agendas we may like, some of those agendas we may not like, some of those agendas we may not care about. I think the influence of evangelicalism politics in much of Latin America is exacerbated by a couple of things. First of all, there are not really very many strong ideologies today in Latin America. I mean, the left, there are a set of left values and certain identity. Nobody knows, honestly, if we're honest, what it means to be left anymore, anywhere. The left is not a clear, coherent, strong, mobilizing ideology anywhere. And
why the left is so?
That's a long history. But I mean,
we still have some time.
The left is a legitimate political force. It pursues, left-wing parties and politicians pursue important goals, particularly in highly unequal societies like Brazil. But since the collapse of the Soviet Union, what is left ideology? It's not clear. It's not a strong ideology in politics today. And liberalism is pretty weak. For 20 years or so, the right in Latin America was mostly liberal. They were mostly about free markets and economic liberalization. They didn't care so much about abortion and gay rights. But that's been weakened tremendously. And so sort of the evangelical agenda is a coherent, clear, agenda that mobilizes people's passions. So it's maybe the strongest ideology in many Latin American countries today. It's not a majority. It's nowhere near a majority. But in a very fragmented political system like Brazil, you mentioned 30 political parties. No political party has more than 20-25% support. In a very fragmented political world, where no other ideology is very strong, a group that represents, 20-25% of the electorate and is really committed and has people willing to get out of bed at 8 a.m. on Saturday morning to go do political work and to go door to door and do really hard political work, like the left used to do in the 1970s and the 1980s. That's something that gives a real advantage. So this is not, I think sometimes we exaggerate the political power of the evangelical right. They're really only often 20-25% of the electorate, but they're the best organized and they're the most committed. And that can get them into the second round of presidential elections almost anywhere in Latin America.
Wow. On the other hand, what about identity and all the debate, the public debate that is going on in the US, here in Brazil, about identity and this role in political debate, and how this can be connected, for example, to your argument of multiracial democracy, and how can this also go to an authoritarian view about society and all the criticism that this debate is going through?
I'm not sure, at least in the United States, I think that the identity is not new. Political identities, social identities are not new. The bases of those identities change. Working class identities were much stronger in South America 50, 60, 70 years ago than they are today. It's true that they're more likely to be, political identities are more likely to be ethnic or religious than class, but the idea that political identities matter is not new, and I don't think it's necessarily dangerous. And it shouldn't shock us that ethnic or racial groups that have historically been marginalized, excluded, and oppressed, that they have relatively strong ethno-political identities. That African Americans in the United States, and it's a more complicated history in politics here in Brazil, but that Afro-Brazilians have a strong identity or think in terms of racial politics should not surprise us. It's affected the lives and livelihood of African Americans and Afro-Brazilians for centuries. Racial politics is not new in the United States, right? The U.S. Constitution was written in part because we had to find a way to preserve slavery. They had to find a way to preserve slavery. We had a civil war over race in the 19th century. The entire politics of the U.S. South, authoritarian, for almost a century after the Civil War, was structured by race, how to exclude African Americans. In the middle of the 20th century, what the primary political battle in the United States was over civil rights. It was about race. So I don't see anything new about race impacting politics in the United States today. Our analysis of identity politics in the United States is that the strongest racial identities are in reaction to the rise of multiracial democracy. Barack Obama didn't talk very much about race. Barack Obama didn't promote African Americans in an unusual way. He was all about a rainbow coalition of different races, ethnicities, and beliefs. Kamala Harris, if you listen to her, is not talking about race. She's not an identity politics politician. The people talking about race and are mobilizing around identity lines are the white Christians who are losing their dominant status.
Fernanda?
I would like to finish my questions maybe with a more theoretical one, but you know, it is also very practical at the same time. Professor, this is a very, very tough question. How can we convince people that democracies can deliver?
That is a hard one. That's another one where if I knew the answer to that question, I would be making a lot of money.
I'm using my minutes, you know, to have the best of you that I can, Professor.
So there is, so the data are pretty clear. There's been a lot of research about how democracies perform relative to authoritarian regimes. And in terms of economic performance, in terms of keeping inflation down, in terms of combating corruption, in terms of combating crime and violence, and in terms of redistribution. So the things that citizens care about, fighting corruption, fighting crime, security, economic growth, jobs, we've studied whether democracies and authoritarian regimes do perform better. And most of the research suggests that there's not a big difference, that there isn't a big difference. We know there's some evidence that democracies in the long run perform a little better, especially in terms of redistribution and corruption. But in general, there's not a huge difference. Now that's not a very sexy finding, but it does make two things clear. It makes clear that the promise of a Bukele or of a Bolsonaro or of the China model is a false promise. Right? We've been seduced by authoritarian models forever. Right? There was a generation of leftists were convinced that Soviet-style, Bolshevik-style communism could, create a better life for workers than democracy, and a worldwide shorter generation of people on the right were convinced that fascism in Europe would solve problems better than liberal democracies. And the left here grew enamored with Castro-style communism. We were enamored with Chavez. The right was enamored with Fujimori. And the data suggests it's simply not true. Authoritarian regimes do not govern better. And one problem is we get very enamored with authoritarian regimes at the beginning, when they have their success. So Fujimori in 1992, 93, his first years, it looked great. But if you follow these cases to the end, if you read the book of Fujimori until the final chapter, you find the most corrupt government in the history of the Western Hemisphere. That's what authoritarianism got you in Peru. And I can promise you, based on a lot of history and a lot of data, the Bukele project will not end well. They sometimes begin well. They look very shiny, very attractive. They don't end well. And so the great advantage of democracy, if democracies and authoritarian regimes perform about the same in terms of combating crime, controlling corruption, growing the economy, lowering inflation, if they're about the same, I, for one, prefer a regime where I'm free to inform myself about the government, where I'm free to criticize the government, where I'm free to oppose the government, and I've got the right every 4 years or 5 years to change the government if I don't like it. Because that's the problem. If you maybe, you like Fujimori on day one, and Peruvians liked Fujimori on day one, and they handed him a blank check, they handed him authoritarian power. They couldn't get it back. They couldn't change the government at day 2 or day 3. And that's the problem in Venezuela. Many Venezuelans were enamored with Chavez and his authoritarian solutions initially, and now they want to change the government and they can't. And that's terrible.
But following your answer now. What about China? You mentioned Chinese model won't prevail or won't be a reference to other countries. Is it so? Why?
Well, it will be a reference. Again, they're successful or seemingly successful countries are always a reference. We always look at, again, the Soviet Union or Cuba or fascist Italy. Now, China. Everybody wants to be like China. But again, it's really hard to replicate in your country what another country did. China had a social revolution, a violent social revolution in the 1940s that created the political regime that exists today. China is also a big country with nuclear weapons and a whole set of unique circumstances. But I can guarantee you it is impossible for any government anywhere in the world, with the possible exception of Vietnam, which also had a social revolution, to replicate China. Nobody can do it. You can't build a Chinese Communist Party. You can't just copy it and build it.
Fernanda, one last question? Or?
No, I think it's great. Yeah.
Well, Professor, thank you so much for being with us. If you have any other message to deliver to people who still believe in democracy, what would you say to them to be optimistic and not skeptical or pessimist about democracies around the world?
First of all, thank you for having me on. It was a lot of fun. My one message is that the autocrats are not as strong as we think. We look around the world and we feel like democracies are in crisis everywhere in the world, and there are serious challenges. And we see cases in which democracies are falling and authoritarian figures are getting elected. Maybe it's Brazil or El Salvador or Hungary or Mexico. But if you look closely, a lot of these authoritarians are weak, they govern badly, they're not popular, and they fail. Whether it's Correa in Ecuador or Hernandez in Honduras, or the strange regime in Guatemala, very, very often authoritarians fail. And so pro-democratic actors continue to have a fighting chance, and they need to not lose hope, to not lose energy, and continue to fight, because democratic forces, I think, are a lot stronger than sometimes they think.
Thank you so much again, Mr. Steven Levitsky. Fernanda Manhota, muito obrigado por me acompanhar nessa entrevista, e principalmente você que nos assistiu aqui. Nós recebemos o autor de Como as Democracias Morrem, Como Salvar a Democracia, Steven Levitsky, cientista político da Universidade de Harvard, gentilmente nos atendeu aqui no CNN Entrevistas. Até a próxima.